As I mentioned, this morning in the church year is All Saints Sunday, a celebration that we are saints, that we're used by God, that we're surrounded by saints, and to especially remember saints who have gone before, who have challenged and guided us along in our faith journey. And this is often a time of the year as well when we focus on generosity and stewardship, well using the finances that God has given us. And so I thought this morning that I would kind of combine these two themes, and I would tell you about some saints who have taught me generosity, kind of where I have learned generosity from. I hope that as I share them, there might be some things that will bless you as well. And I also hope that it'll bring to mind for you saints who have taught you generosity in your own life. So the first one I will start out with is one that you probably have heard about. It's a saint that I learned about when I was yet a child, a man who grew enormously in his generosity when he encountered Jesus. His name is Zacchaeus. And we hear of Zacchaeus in the Gospel of Luke, one of the four accounts of Jesus' life, in the 19th chapter of Luke. So here's this man we learn from. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. Now, I've talked in the past about how hated tax collectors were. They worked for the Roman Empire, collecting their taxes. They were essentially traitors for the Jewish people. That's how they were considered. And he's the chief traitor, and he was rich. Well, the reason he was probably rich is because he was skimming and collecting extra taxes for his own benefit. He was trying to see Jesus, who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." I just love how Jesus invites himself over for dinner, right? So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and say, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Why would he go and spend time with Zacchaeus, hated in the community?" Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." When I learned of this wee little man, Zacchaeus, I started learning about how when Jesus gets a hold of you and interacts with you, it changes your sense of generosity. He's one saint. And then another saint that taught me about generosity was the home pastor of my church, Pastor Ernie Schmidt, who's passed away now. He was my pastor all the time that I was growing up, and I remember one particular sermon when I was a teenager. Ernie was a pulpit preacher, and we had a large pulpit in my church, but I remember him stepping out of the pulpit on one occasion, and he said, "I just want to address you as a fellow member of this congregation, not so much as your pastor." And he went on to explain that he was financially generous to the life of the congregation, as other members are as well. And Ernie said something that I fully understand now in a way that I didn't then. Ernie said, and I would say the exact same thing about St. Paul's. He said, "I see on a daily basis just what a blessing this church is. I see how people are growing in their faith journey, how this church is supporting and providing, how it's helping people out in need. I see this on a daily basis at St. Paul's of how we're helping people along in their faith journey. And Ernie said, and I would say the same thing to you, that's why I financially support this church, because I know all the blessings that are coming from that support. Carolyn and I have tithed almost our whole marriage, and we gladly do that knowing that it supports the life of the church. The other thing that I didn't think about at the time with Ernie, but I understand now in a different, deeper way, is that Ernie was also saying, don't just give my time. I mean, he worked hard as a pastor, and I certainly know that as well. And I've heard pastors say, well, I give generously of my time, and so not of my finances to the church. But when I hear a pastor say this, and I think the same thing, but I can work as hard as I want as your pastor, but it will not pay the utility bills here. I can work as hard as I want as your pastor, but it won't pay the salary for the rest of our staff. It won't provide materials for our children growing in faith. It won't help our young people to go off and have faith-building experiences. We have a budget of something like over $400,000, and treasure, or I should say, talent and time don't pay those bills as well. And I learned that from my pastor, Pastor Ernie. Then a third person that changed and deepened my way of thinking about giving was one of my seminary professors, Wally Taylor. Wally Taylor was this very precise man, and he was so gifted at teaching the scriptures. I mean, he knows more about Greek than, he's forgotten more about Greek than I will ever know. He just, he could just wax rhapsodic and in great depth about any place in the New Testament. But as Wally would teach us about Scripture, he was also a good pastor, and he would teach us about faith, about being on a faith journey. And I remember in one class, Wally was teaching us, and it was a passage about giving and generosity. And Wally talked for a few minutes about his own giving, about how before he had children, and he told us the percentage, which was well above 10%. He said, I was able to do that, my wife and I, before we had kids. And when he was my teacher, he had kids. He said, unfortunately, we've had to modify our finances, all the expenses of kids, but he was still above 10%. And he said, I know when the kids are out of the house, we'll have the opportunity to be extra generous again. And what I remember in Wally he wasn't talking about what he had to do, what he felt his requirement was. He was thinking about what he could do, about how generous he could be. And I remember that influencing me as well. And then a third person and a fourth as well kind of combined. I'm still learning and growing, and a little over a year now, we lost a wonderful saint in our congregation. Those who knew her were very, very blessed by Carolyn Mitchell. And Carolyn was very generous to leave a part of her estate in her will to remember St. Paul's. And she particularly designated it for the Fellowship Hall renovation. It's been kind of talked about for years to renovate the Fellowship Hall kind of underneath of us and the kitchen as well. I would comment on that. When I first was introduced to St. Paul's, I was in the interview process, and Jim Shoemaker gave me a tour around the building here at St. Paul's. I remember being kind of impressed, and this looks nice, and isn't the sanctuary beautiful and everything? And Jim led me into the Fellowship Hall, and I'm just telling you, my initial reaction was like, it's a little dark and dank in here. I have to tell you, I don't think of our fellowship hall that way anymore. I've been down there for so many ministry and fellowship events. I don't think of it that same way. It was just my initial reaction. So St. Paul's knows this. We've been planning to do this, and Carolyn knew this. And so she left this significant gift in her will to kind of get things started. Church Council found out as well that also in her lifetime, she would slowly be making gifts for this project as well. And our leadership said, you know what? This gift is really this is gonna be the start that we need. In fact, we even had a second gift from another member. He'd passed away kind of well before, but it was still in the process. Jim Ilsner didn't designate his gift as well. So we gave a good part of that away to bless in other ways, but we said, let's take part of that gift and add that as well. And you've probably heard there's a team of folks who've been starting that process of what it will take to renovate the fellowship hall. You'll hear about that, in fact, at our congregational meeting. But I've learned from Carolyn how even in death, you have that ability to be generous, to be giving, and to kind of get things moving, as Carolyn's gift has done. And then one last saint, and probably the one who's touched me the most. He was a man in my first congregation. His name was Milt Simmerman. He was actually my next door neighbor. The parsonage was right next to Milt and his wife, Charlotte. Just a wonderful, dear man, very, very well respected in the community. Years before, he and a few other businessmen had pretty much saved the town. The major factory in town, a General Electric company. Those of you who are younger will not even know what these are, but the company made flash bulbs. They were little bulbs that you would put in your camera, and they would blow out in a big bright flash and would help you take a picture. Well, whenever they invented the technology of what flashes are now, the company wasn't needed anymore, and so all these people in town were thrown out of work. Well, Milt and these other businessmen went out and aggressively courted new businesses, and they were careful to court a variety of businesses so the town wouldn't be damaged by one business closing. But you know, what I didn't realize at first about Milt is he had to be a millionaire, and probably a multimillionaire. He'd been a builder. Numerous houses in the community had been built by him. In fact, the road that I lived on and numerous other roads were named after his wife and his children. And he'd been very smart. At the end of his career, he built himself some housing units, rental units, and he had a number of them. And it dawned on me one day, just on the rental income he was getting from all these apartments, as I say, he had to be a multimillionaire, but you wouldn't know it. The house was an ordinary house. His wife drove this old beat-up station wagon. It was like that proverbial unknown millionaire next door. But toward the end of when I was at that congregation, Milt started to have a series of mini strokes. And it was sad to see. It sort of diminished him. He'd had a couple and he couldn't walk anymore. He'd had a couple more and his senses were affected. A couple more and his speech became much slower and more labored. And I remember the last visit that I made to Milt. He told me a story. And the story was when he and his wife Charlotte were just starting out. And they used what many folks back then did, like the envelope method. You put your money in for your offering and for your food money and your rent money and divided out your income in that way. And Milt told me of how he and Charlotte took the last money that they had and put it in the offering. And he was so emotional and so intense about that. And I thought about that later. Why was it in his last days that this is the memory? He could have repeated to me the story of how he'd saved the town, or could have talked about how well he was doing. what I realized is he had learned as a young man to trust God with his finances and with his life. And he was, of course, coming into a time when he was trusting God again in his last days. I will never forget that story from Milt and those other saints who have taught me about generosity. Again, I hope that those stories are a blessing to you. And I would encourage you this week, as you think about saints who have been a blessing to you, which of them have taught you about the great value of generosity? Amen.